So we're diving into the world of online pornography today.
Ooh, interesting.
You wanted to know how it's all changed, right? How the move online has impacted everything.
The content, the viewer experience, yeah, it's fascinating.
Exactly. We've got research papers, articles going all the way back to 2002.
Wow, back to 2002? That's a lot to unpack.
It is, but we're going to trace the whole evolution of online porn, uncover the trends, the controversies, and hopefully give you a whole new perspective.
I think a lot of people will be surprised by what we find.
For sure. One of the first things that jumps out from all this research is something Simon Hardy called the Great Crash of 2006.
Oh yeah, 2006 was a big turning point.
It was. Free streaming sites were suddenly everywhere, totally disrupting the industry.
It was a complete upheaval. Before 2006, it was all about paid subscriptions, physical media. It's crazy to think about how different things were.
Right, and Hardy points out that this is when genres like gonzo and amateur really took off.
Yeah, cheaper to make, definitely. But they also grabbed attention in this new online world.
And what's so fascinating to me is how this ties into the rise of algorithms.
Oh, absolutely. Algorithms changed everything. They started shaping the landscape of what people saw.
Think about how you consume content online. It's all tailored to your preferences, what you've viewed before.
Exactly. And that same logic applies to online pornography. What you see is influenced by what the algorithm thinks you want.
So it's not just about what's out there, it's about what the algorithm decides to show you. Kind of a mind-blowing shift, isn't it?
It is. It really changes the whole dynamic. And you know what? It actually leads us to another interesting concept. This illusion of reality.
The illusion of reality.
Yeah, Hardy describes gonzo with its shaky camera work, often filmed from the performer's perspective. It's all about trying to create that you were there feeling.
Oh, I see. Like you're part of the action.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? This pursuit of realness in porn, could it actually influence how we view sex in general?
That's an interesting question. Are those blurred lines between performance and what's perceived as authentic changing our expectations of real sex?
That's a valid question. If we're constantly exposed to this heightened, often unrealistic portrayal of sex, does it change our understanding of what real intimacy is?
It's something to think about for sure. And then we throw amateur pornography into the mix, which adds another layer of complexity.
Right. At first glance, you might dismiss it as just amateur, but there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
More than meets the eye.
Definitely. There's a study from 2024 by Jakubowicz, Benjamin, and Idesis that really digs into the motivations of people involved in amateur pornography.
Oh, interesting. What did they find?
Well, some of their findings are pretty surprising. For instance, some people said they got involved to promote healthy sexuality.
Really? To promote healthy sexuality?
Yeah, and to challenge harmful stereotypes. It really challenges those assumptions we might have about amateur content.
It does. But of course, there are potential downsides too, right?
Of course. The study also talks about the stigma associated with it, the challenges it can create in relationships. It's a complex landscape, that's for sure.
Every layer we peel back seems to reveal even more complexity. Algorithms, the blurring of reality, the nuances of amateur content, and then there's this idea of the pornification of culture.
Cornification of culture, that's a big one.
What does that even mean?
Well, it's basically the idea that elements of pornography, the aesthetics, themes, they're starting to show up in mainstream media and pop culture.
So even if you're not actively seeking out pornography, it could still be influencing you in subtle ways.
That's the idea. We have researchers like Atwood and McNair who have been tracking this trend for years. They've written a ton about it.
Give me an example.
Think about reality TV shows. There's one called Pants Off, Dance Off. Everyday people just stripping on TV.
Wow. That's a far cry from what was considered acceptable on TV just a few decades ago.
It is. And it makes you wonder how much this has already impacted us. Have the lines of what we consider normal been blurred because of this?
It's a big question. Is it a good thing, a bad thing, or somewhere in between?
These are the questions we're going to explore as we keep going with this deep dive. But for now, think about how this pornification might be showing up in your own life. Are you seeing it in unexpected places? And if so, how does it make you feel?
It's definitely a lot to think about. We've covered free streaming, the blurring of reality, the nuances of amateur content, and now this pornification of culture. And we're not even done yet. But let's pause here, let you, the listener, digest everything we've talked about so far. And when we come back, we'll get into the ethics and challenges of this whole world of online pornography. Stick with us.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were just getting into this idea of pornification.
Right, how those themes from pornography end up in mainstream culture.
Yeah, and it kind of naturally leads us into a conversation about the ethics of it all.
The societal implications of online pornography, it's a pretty complicated landscape.
Definitely not a simple topic.
Yeah.
Feels like every time you think you've got a handle on it, there's another layer.
Right. And then you throw in how polarized the conversation gets.
It's either inherently harmful or it's free expression that should be protected.
And then you have everyone else somewhere in between trying to figure out where they stand.
Trying to navigate this super nuanced terrain. It's tough. Part of the problem is the stigma we still have about sexuality in general.
It's hard to have an open and honest conversation about something when it feels taboo.
Exactly. Makes it even harder to grapple with all the nuances.
It's like people are almost afraid to ask the tough questions.
Like, how do we balance individual freedom with the potential for harm?
Where do we even begin to draw the line? Are there lines?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And the toughest part is there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer.
Makes sense. What might be empowering for one person could be damaging for another.
Absolutely. Context is everything.
So let's get into some specifics. When we talk about the potential harms of online pornography, what are the big concerns, the things experts have raised?
Well, one of the biggest is addiction. We were talking earlier about how algorithms shape our experience online.
Right, they keep feeding us the stuff they think we'll like.
Exactly. Well, those same algorithms can create some really unhealthy consumption patterns.
Especially with something as stimulating as pornography.
Think about that rabbit hole you go down on social media.
You start scrolling and clicking and hours disappear.
It's like that, except it's not just about losing time.
It's about that content becoming all-consuming.
Right. It can get to the point where it interferes with other parts of your life.
Work, relationships, your health.
It becomes this dominant force in your life.
And then there's the impact on body image and self-esteem, especially for younger viewers.
That's a huge concern. Online pornography often presents a really distorted view of bodies and sexuality.
It's also idealized, airbrushed, enhanced.
It's not real. And when people start comparing themselves to that, especially young people,
It can be so damaging. It messes with your sense of what's normal, what's desirable.
leads to all sorts of anxieties. Then there's the concern that some types of pornography can desensitize viewers to violence.
Or exploitation. Is there evidence for that?
It's complicated. The research on the link between pornography and real-life behavior is pretty murky.
So no easy answers?
No,
Yeah.
human behavior is complex. We can't just say pornography causes violence. Too simplistic.
Right. There's so many factors that influence someone's action.
Exactly. But even if we can't draw a direct line from A to B, I think it's still important to be aware of the potential for desensitization.
To think critically about what we're consuming.
Even if a violent movie doesn't make you go commit a crime, maybe it makes you a little less sensitive to violence in general.
That makes sense. It's about being aware of the potential effects, the psychological and emotional impact.
And making choices that fit with your values.
Okay, so we've talked about some potential downsides, but we should also acknowledge that not everyone who watches pornography has a negative experience.
Of course not. For some people, it can be a positive experience, even empowering.
It can be a way to explore your sexuality, your desires, to figure out your boundaries.
And for some couples, it can actually enhance their intimacy. Try something new.
We have to remember that different people have different needs and preferences.
Exactly. What works for one person might not work for another.
What's harmful in one context might be totally fine in a different one.
Right. It's not about making pornography the villain. It's about approaching it thoughtfully,
Having a nuanced perspective.
being informed and responsible, figuring out what works for you.
Now, there's one last thing I want to touch on. Consent.
With amateur content and things like revenge porn, it's gotten really complicated.
It's a whole other level of complexity.
At least with professional pornography, there are regulations, although they're not perfect.
But with amateur content, who knows what's going on?
How do you know everyone involved has given their consent?
And that's where things can get really messy.
People's intimate images get shared online without their permission. It's a huge violation.
Of privacy, trust, dignity, it can be really damaging.
We need to fight against that. Educate people about consent.
Both online and offline, and hold people accountable.
It's not just about being mindful of what you watch. It's about creating a culture of consent.
Where it's valued and respected.
I'm with you on that.
So we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. The history, the genres, the ethical questions. Your head must be spinning.
A lot to take in.
But we're not done yet. When we come back, we're going to shift gears and look towards the future of online pornography.
Oh, the future. That's interesting.
What's on the horizon? What challenges might we face? Stay tuned.
Welcome back. We've been on quite a journey through the world of online pornography.
We have, from its evolution to the complexities of amateur content, the ethical debates, and its impact on our culture.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
It really makes you think about our relationship with sexuality and technology, doesn't it? And how we navigate social norms in the digital age.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, there aren't any easy answers. It's a world of nuance, gray areas, and a whole lot of room for debate. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly. So for this last part of our deep dive, I want to look ahead.
To the future.
Yeah. What trends and challenges are on the horizon for the world of online pornography? What do the next few years hold?
Well, one thing's for sure. Technology is going to keep playing a massive role. We've already seen how the internet and streaming services have changed everything.
Revolutionized access and consumption.
Exactly.
Mm.
But there's a whole new wave of innovation coming. Think about virtual reality, for instance.
VR is huge right now. How could it change the landscape of pornography?
It has the potential to create these super immersive experiences, incredibly realistic. It could really change how people interact with this kind of content.
That's kind of exciting, but also a little scary. What about the ethical implications?
That's the big question, right? How do we ensure consent and safety in these virtual spaces? How do we prevent exploitation in a world that feels more and more real?
It feels like with technology, we're always playing catch-up. We figure out one set of problems and a whole new set pops up.
It definitely keeps things interesting. And that's why it's so important to think ahead. Anticipate the consequences of these advancements.
So VR is on the horizon. What else might we see shaping the future of online pornography?
I think personalization is a big one. We're already seeing algorithms tailoring suggestions based on what you've watched.
But it's going to get even more sophisticated.
Exactly. Imagine a world where you get a custom-made experience perfectly matched to your desires.
Wow. But doesn't that create a risk of filter bubbles, where people only see content that reinforces their existing biases?
That's a valid concern. Similar to what's happening on social media, you could end up in an echo chamber of your own preferences, potentially harmful ones.
So it's not just you are what you eat, it's you are what you watch.
Exactly. Being mindful of the content you consume is more crucial than ever.
Now, amid all this technology and personalization, there's also a movement towards ethical and feminist pornography. It seems like a direct response to the concerns we've been discussing.
It is. This movement is all about creating content that is respectful, consensual, and inclusive. It's about shifting the focus away from profit and toward genuine pleasure and empowerment.
For both the performers and the viewers.
Yes. It's like a breath of fresh air in an industry that often feels so exploitative.
So the future of online pornography is going to be pretty dynamic.
It is. VR, personalized content, and this push for ethical production.
It's a lot to process. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway is that the conversation about online pornography is far from over.
It's constantly evolving. We can't ignore it.
We have to approach it with open minds and critical thinking.
Challenge assumptions, consider different perspectives, and stay informed. It's an ever-changing landscape.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. I hope our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of this complex and fascinating world.
It's not just about individual desires. It's a reflection of our culture, our values, our understanding of sexuality. It's a reflection of us.
And the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep exploring these issues, ask questions, and draw your own conclusions.
That's the beauty of a deep dive.
So keep diving.